As many of us know, in the 1700s, France was one of the major powerhouses in the eastern hemisphere of our world. From their military powers to their new ideas and revelations, France seemed to be untouchable. There was one big problem. France hated Britain, who at the time was having trouble controlling their 13 colonies in the New World. Eventually, France started to fund the American Revolution just so they could help beat the British. After the US won the war, the new American people were all like, woohoo! And at the time, so was King Louis XVI and his people, until someone decides to look at their bank account and say, oh crap, we're seriously out of money. Now, this couldn't have been such a huge problem if the king didn't like spending so much money on luxuries. And how does a poor nation pay for something like that? Yes, by heavily taxing all of their citizens. But not just any citizens, only the poor were taxed, so all the rich 1%ers in France didn't have to pay taxes. That makes complete sense, right? The people with the most money aren't giving any of it up. Only the people without money are. Now, the peasants and urban poor were beginning to become unrestless from the rise in prices of necessities. Many of them decided to show their resentment towards the falling regime through riots and looting. During the fall of 1786, King Louis XVI Controller General Charles Alexander de Calonne. Wow, that is one handsome man. Well, besides that, Charles presented a financial reform package that made a universal land tax that the wealthy would no longer be exempt from. Of course, this really infuriated that rich aristocrats of France. To stop revolts, King Louis called for a meeting of his states generals, an assembly representing France's clergy, nobility, and middle class for the first time since 1614. The meeting was set up for May 5th, 1789. In the meantime, the people of France had time to write a cahiers de doléances, or list of grievances, to present to the king. Now, since 1614, the French population has changed greatly. The non-aristocratic Third Estate made up 98% of the people. Still, the other two parties could outvote them. Sounds like a bit of a problem. That lead up to the May 5th meeting, the Third Estate began to mobilize support for equal representation and the abolishment of the noble veto. In other words, they wanted voting by head and not by status. Now, not all orders were against each other. All of the orders share a common desire for fiscal and judicial reform, as well as a representative form of government. The nobles in particular were loath to give up the privileges they enjoyed under the traditional system. By the time the Estates General convened at Versailles, the highly public debate over its voting process had erupted into hostility between the three orders, eclipsing the original purpose of the meeting and the authority of the man who had convened it. On June 17th, the talks over procedure stalled. The Third Estate met alone and formally adopted the title of National Assembly. 3 days later, they met in a nearby indoor tennis court and took the so-called tennis court oath, vowing not to disperse until constitutional reform had been achieved. Within a week, most of the clerical deputies and 47 liberal nobles had joined them, and on June 27th, Louis XVI grudgingly absorbed all three orders into the new assembly. On June 12th, as the National Assembly continued to meet at Versailles, fear and violence began to fall over the capital. Although excited about the recent breakdown of royal power, the Parisians grew panicked as rumors of impending military co-op began to circulate. On July 14th, rioters stormed the Bastille fortress in order to collect crucial gunpowder and weapons. This event is considered to be the official start of the French Revolution. This created a wave of revolutionary fervor and widespread hysteria across the countryside. Revolting against years of exploitations, peasants began to loot and burn down the houses of tax collectors, landlords, and seigneurial elites. Known as the Great Fear, the agrarian insurrection hastened the growing exodus of nobles from the countryside and inspired the National Constituent Assembly to abolish feudalism on August 4th, 1789, signing what historians called the Death Certificate of the Old Order. Also on the 4th, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a statement of democratic principles grounded in the philosophical and political ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. This stated that the Assembly had decided to forget ancient regime and replace it with a system based on equal opportunity, freedom of speech, and a representative government. Now, drafting a formal constitution proved much more of a challenge for the National Constituent Assembly, which had the added burden of functioning as a legislator during harsh economic times. For months, its members wrestled with fundamental questions about the shape and expanse of France's new political landscape. For instance, who could be responsible for electing delegates? Would the clergy owe allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church or the French government? Perhaps most importantly, how much authority would the king retain after trying to flee the country with many rich aristocrats in June of 1791? Adopted on September 3, 1791, France's first written constitution echoed the more moderate voices in the assembly, establishing a constitutional monarchy in which the king enjoyed royal veto power and the ability to appoint ministers. This compromise did not sit well with the influential radicals like Maximilien de Robespierre, Camille Desmoulins, and Georges Danton, who began drumming up popular support for a more republican form of government and the trial of King Louis XVI. In April of 1792, the newly elected Legislative Assembly decided to declare war on Austria and Prussia, two places where it was believed that French aristocratic emigrants were building counter-revolutionary alliances. On the domestic side, the political crisis took a radical turn when a group of insurgents, led by extremist Jacobson, attacked the royal residence in Paris and arrested King Louis on August 10, 1792. For the following month, a wave of violence swept France where hundreds of accused counter-revolutionists were massacred by the Parisians. The Legislative Assembly was then replaced by the National Convention, which destroyed the monarchy and established the French Republic. On January 21, 1793, King Louis XVI was condemned to death for treason and was killed by the guillotine. His wife, Mary Antoinette, suffered the same death 9 months later. Following the king's executions, war with various European powers and intense divisions within the National Convention led to the most violent and turbulent phase in the French Revolution. In June 1793, the Jacobins seized control of the National Convention and instituted a series of radical measures, including the eradication of Christianity. They also unleashed the Bloody Reign of Terror, which was a 10-month period in which suspected enemies of the revolution were guillotined by the thousands. Many of the killings were carried out under orders from Robespierre, who dominated the Draconian Committee of Public Safety until his own execution on July 28, 1794. It was pretty ironic because he was also guillotined like those other 1,000 people. His death erected the beginning of the Thermidorian reaction, which was a moderate phase in which the French people revolted against the Reign of Terror's excesses. On August 22, 1795, the National Convention, composed largely of Girondins who had survived the Reign of Terror, approved a new constitution that created France's first bicameral legislature. Executive power would lie in the hands of a 5-member directory appointed by Parliament. Royalists and Jacobins protested the new regime, but were swiftly silenced by the army, now led by a young and successful general named Napoleon Bonaparte. The Directory's 4 years in power were riddled with financial crisis, popular discontent, inefficiency, and above all, political corruption. By the late 1790s, the directors relied almost entirely on the military to maintain their authority and had ceded much of their power to the generals in the field. On November 9, 1799, as frustration with their leadership reached a fever pitch, Bonaparte staged a coup d'état, abolishing the Directory and appointing himself France's first consul. The event marked the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic era, in which France would come to dominate much of continental Europe.